Hello and welcome. Uh, Cash flows are very important for a business. They are even more important than profit. Cash flows help any business to meet short term and long term liability. In other words, they assist with the liquidity and solvency of a company. The typical cash flow statement of a company presents cash flows in three categories: cash from operations, cash from investments, and cash from financing. Operating cash flows are usually on account of customers who pay the company, so a source of inflow, and suppliers, including suppliers of labor such as employees, to whom cash has to be paid. So they are the reason for outflow. Cash flow on investments, on the other hand, is specific to long-term assets. Buying long-term assets will result in an outflow, and selling long-term assets will result in an inflow. And cash flow from financing refers to inflows from lenders and shareholders, and it also includes the outflows to lenders and shareholders, such as payment of dividends or repayment of loans and so on. But this typical structure of a cash flow statement is of limited use in assessing the liquidity of or solvency of any company. To do that, we need to have a more nuanced understanding of cash flows. In this lesson, we will highlight 5 different levels of cash flows, and we will identify how each of these is used in computing ratios and similar metrics in order to assess the liquidity and solvency of a company. Hello and welcome to this lesson in which we look at cash flows and how these can be used to analyze the liquidity and solvency of a company. So what will we cover in this lesson? Briefly, we will review the contents and structure of cash flow statements, and then we will take a deep dive into what cash flow actually means. We will identify 5 different types, or I like to call them levels of cash flows, which are used to measure and manage liquidity of a business. Hopefully, by the end of the lesson, you will be able to understand the differences between these 5 different levels and apply them in the appropriate context. Now, analysis of cash flow patterns can reveal a level of debt servicing capabilities that is either stronger or weaker than would be apparent from profits. Basically, that's saying that cash flows can be a stronger indication of liquidity and solvency than profits. Some basic ideas before we dive into the nuances. So, cash is not profit. So, as we all know, profit is based on sales and expenses, but not all sales is collected immediately as cash, and not all expenses are immediately paid for as cash. So the timing of expenses and revenues differ quite, differ from cash outflows and cash inflows. We also know that increases in assets result in a decrease in cash flow. So you buy an asset, you pay for it. And increases in liability result in an increase in cash flow. So, for example, you borrow money from a bank, then liability increases, that would result in an increase in cash flows. So, in summary, asset decrease, cash inflow, likewise, liability increases a cash inflow. And cash flow is a result of an asset increase or a liability decrease. So here is a typical cash flow statement. It breaks down into 3 parts, which is one is the cash flow from operation, second is cash flow on investing, and the third is cash flow on financing. Operating cash flows, the inflows come as collection from customers, and the outflows are payment to suppliers. And here, suppliers include suppliers of both material, labor, and other services. So suppliers is to be viewed broadly in this case. Investment cash flows are collections from selling long-term assets. So in this section, investment cash flows, we focus only on long-term assets. And outflows under this heading are the result of payment for acquisition of long-term assets. And financing cash flows are collections from banks and shareholders. So you take a loan or issue new shares, you have a financing inflow, and repayment to banks or payment to shareholders as dividends or repurchase of stock. These will result in outflows under the head cash flow from financing. So, for the purpose of analysis, not for statutory requirements, but for the purpose of analysis, there are at least 5 different levels of cash flow, which is what we want to talk about now. The first is funds from operation, which is defined as net income plus depreciation and other non-cash items. So, we know that depreciation, amortization, and so on are expenses, but these do not necessarily these do not result in any cash outflows, but these are deducted in calculating the net income. So when we find the funds from operation, these are added back to the net income, right? Then we have what is known as the operating cash flow. Now, funds from operation are adjusted for changes in working capital. Working capital is defined as current assets minus current liabilities. So when working capital goes up, it results in cash outflow, and when working capital goes down, it can result in a cash inflow. So operating cash flows are defined as funds from operations adjusted for changes in working capital. Changes in working capital can be either an increase in working capital or a decrease in working capital. All right, following this, we have the free operating cash flow. So the operating cash flow minus the capital expenditures, and these are the routine capital expenditures. And this is distinguished from strategic capex, which are typically large and happen once in a while. So routine capex are relatively smaller in size but happen every year. Of course, routine capital expenditures do not show up clearly in the cash flow statement, so these need to be estimated. But based on the estimation of routine capital expenditures, we can compute the free operating cash flows. At the next level, we have discretionary cash flow, which is the free operating cash flow minus the cash dividends. Now, the dividends paid are the result of the dividend policy of the company, and the cash dividends, when they are taken out from the free operating cash flows, leaves what is known as discretionary cash flows. Now, discretionary because now the company can do what it wants with this money to make some strategic investments, so it can be acquisition of another company, it can be asset disposal, and so on and so forth. Now, after all these strategic investments, etc., are done, what is left is known as the pre-financing cash flow. Now, the pre-financing cash flow could be negative or it could be positive. So if the pre-financing cash flow is negative, then the company will require financing. And now this financing can come either in the form of debt or equity. So low growth companies may typically have strong free cash flow owing to the low capital needs, but high growth companies may often have low or even negative free cash flow because the capital needed to support growth. And of course, I use the word free cash flow rather loosely here, so you have to be precise in your definition of which level of cash flow you're talking about. Now, there is no simple correlation between creditworthiness and the level of current cash flows. So there are a few caveats that I would mention here. First of all, look at a pattern of cash flows, typically over 2 past years, the current year, and try to project at least the next 2 years of cash flows. Secondly, when you are looking at the cash flows, make sure that the level at which you analyze is suitable to purpose. For example, companies may be very working capital intensive. In their case, the operating cash flow is appropriate. But companies that are capital intensive, that means they are investing a lot in terms of fixed assets every year, then the free cash flow may be more appropriate, and so on. So the context is important in deciding which cash flow to be used. for the purpose of analysis. In a later lesson, I will discuss some of the ratios that are computed using cash flows and how these ratios are to be interpreted for the purpose of assessing liquidity and solvency. So, analysis of cash flow in relation to capital requirements begins with an examination of a company's capital needs, including both working and fixed capital. So, what is cash flow adequacy? Ultimately, it is the company's ability to finance capital maintenance requirements internally as well as its ability to finance capital additions. And all of this has to be done while maintaining its creditworthiness and also repaying its debt on time. With that, we come to the end of this lesson. In a subsequent lesson, we are going to talk about ratios using cash flows and how to interpret these ratios in different contexts for the purpose of assessing.